I am honored by your invitation and very grateful to have the chance to be with you at this important time when, as a country, we engage in the ongoing and important work of reconciliation. Last month, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its summary report and findings. Some of us here today were last together at Rideau Hall at the ceremony to mark the end of the Commission's 7 years of hard work, helping our country understanding the truth about that dark chapter of our history. It's an event I will never forget. It was an experience that will remain with me, not just in my heart, but in my actions as we move forward together. That day, I heard stories that touched me and other caring Canadians deeply. Stories I will tell to my own children in time, because it's important that they know that the things we believe about ourselves as Canadians, that we're generous, that we treat others with respect and fairness, well, those things have not always been true. I'll tell them about the survivors I met that day, and to the survivors here today, know that your stories will be shared. And I'll tell them why there were 2 empty chairs in that room in Rideau Hall. N'importe quel parent ou enseignant vous le dira. Le sens de la justice sociale est plus aigu chez les jeunes. Je sais que mes enfants, tout comme les vôtres, voudront savoir comment nous ferons face à l'avenir ensemble. Comment nous trouverons le chemin de la réconciliation maintenant que la vérité commence à être connue. This is an especially important conversation to have as we prepare to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Confederation. We need to recognize that ours was a nation forged without the meaningful participation of our Aboriginal peoples. That this country has endured, as unlikely as it is, for a century and a half is cause for celebration. But at the same time, this commemoration stands as a reminder of much hard work that remains. 150 years on, we've yet to complete the unfinished business of Confederation. Which brings me to the 2 key themes that I'd like to address today. 2 interrelated challenges that we must get right if we are all to make progress on the essential work of nation building and rebuilding. First, the urgent need for a renewed relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples in Canada. One built on trust, recognition, and respect for rights, and a commitment that the status quo must end. And second, the importance of fairness and equality of opportunity for Aboriginal peoples in Canada. On the subject of relationship, as I said, we're talking about a century and a half of formal relations, and viewed with a longer lens, centuries more before that. A relationship symbolized by treaties, and in this part of the country, by the 2-row wampum. It would be unfair and historically inaccurate to blame any one government for the failed relationship between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples. That failure is shared by generations of political leaders at all levels of government. But I think it is fair to ask whether the approach of the current government is actually working to help mend damaged relationships, restore broken trust, and support First Nations communities in achieving their full potential. Je sais que c'est une tâche qui tenait à cœur à mes récents prédécesseurs libéraux. Il y a un peu plus d'une décennie, l'ancien gouvernement libéral mené par le premier ministre Paul Martin a lancé un processus conjoint entre le gouvernement fédéral, les gouvernements provinciaux et les gouvernements autochtones. L'objectif consistait à établir des priorités et à trouver des solutions pour relever les défis des communautés autochtones. Le résultat de ce dialogue s'appelle l'accord de Kelowna. At the core of the Kelowna Accord was a nation-to-nation collaborative plan that sought to close the unacceptable inequality gap that exists in too many of your communities. It sought to ensure that those you represent have access to basic rights, things like safe housing and clean drinking water. It was a plan to boost education levels, to recognize your governance rights as full partners in the Confederation and create sustainable economic growth in your communities. But then, the opposition parties joined to defeat Mr. Martin's government. Harper came to power, and Kelowna and all that it represented was gone. In the last 10 years, whatever meaningful relationship building that had been underway has given way to political theater and the illusion of progress. Harper's legacy includes government-led legislation that demonstrates a striking and shocking lack of understanding of what is needed to move beyond both the Indian Act and the paternalistic Ottawa knows best approach to governance. Things like the innocuously named Safe Drinking Water on First Nations Act, the Matrimonial Property Act, or the First Nations Financial Transparency Act might sound like good initiatives from their titles. But take a closer look, and it's clear that they're just the latest examples of federal interference, of the government dictating terms rather than working in partnership to support First Nations governance. Mr. Harper's legacy might have included finally closing the inexcusable funding gap and gap in learning outcomes for First Nation students. But when Chiefs in Assembly refused to accept a fundamentally flawed education bill, his government used it as an excuse to abandon the process entirely. More than happy, I'm sure, to reassign the money, as has been so often the case with this government. Mr. Harper a aussi créé de faux espoirs en matière de résolution des revendications territoriales et de mise en application des droits issus de traités. Il a rejeté les demandes de tenir une enquête publique au sujet des disparitions et des assassinats de femmes et de filles autochtones. Plus récemment, il est resté complètement muet au sujet des recommandations faites par la Commission Vérité et Réconciliation. Voilà le vrai héritage de M. Harper. But the good news is that this October, voters will have an opportunity to choose a different government, a better government. One that understands that the constitutionally guaranteed rights of Aboriginal peoples in Canada are not an inconvenience, but rather a sacred obligation central to what Canada is as a nation. That our futures are inextricably intertwined, that the Crown must always act honorably and in good faith when dealing with Aboriginal peoples. When I say that we must complete the unfinished work of Confederation, I mean that Canada needs a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Aboriginal communities. A relationship based on recognition, rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. One that is rooted in the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One that is guided by the spirit and intent of the original treaty relationship, and one that respects the decisions of our courts. One that takes us beyond our formal agreements and speaks to how we ought to treat one another, person to person and spirit to spirit. One that remembers that when we conduct ourselves with dignity, we manifest our respect for the creation and for the Creator. And we don't need this kind of renewed relationship only because it's the right thing to do, though it most assuredly is the right thing to do. A renewed relationship will also set us on the path to the responsible economic growth we need and the shared future prosperity we all deserve. Our election platform will spell out our commitments in greater detail, but I can share with you 3 of the ways in which we hope to get that renewal started. First, as a matter of national priority, we will develop a federal reconciliation framework created in full partnership with Aboriginal peoples. Reconciliation starts with recognizing and respecting Aboriginal title and rights, including treaty rights, as a business relationship that has not yet been closed. A Liberal government will do just that, not only in accordance with the constitutional obligations, but also with those enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, something the current government has steadfastly refused to do. To this end, we will conduct a full review of the legislation unilaterally imposed on Aboriginal peoples by the Harper government through the lens of Section 35 of the Constitution, where measures are found to be in conflict with Aboriginal rights, where they are inconsistent with the principles of good governance, or where they simply make no public policy sense, we will rescind them. Bill C-51 is an excellent example. I know it's a piece of legislation that is of concern to many Aboriginal peoples, and it concerns Liberals as well. Liberals have always understood the need to balance our security with protection of our rights and freedoms. And while we support the security measures in this bill, we are committed to repairing and repealing the sections that are cause for so much concern. Simply put, Indigenous peoples standing up for their rights are not terrorists and never should be branded as such. This reconciliation framework will also include mechanisms to resolve grievances associated with existing historical treaties and modern land claims agreements. The current process simply does not work. We will, with First Nations, redesign how Canada negotiates and fully implements modern treaties. In some cases, the work towards reconciliation is already underway, but efforts are hindered by narrow federal mandates and lack of action. We will work with First Nations to achieve fair and just resolutions. This includes addressing the issue of governance. The reconciliation framework will include mechanisms to advance and strengthen self-government. I want you to know that I appreciate how challenging this work can be. The injustices that took place over centuries cannot be undone immediately, no matter how good our intentions. But I also understand how critically important it is for First Nations to be full partners at those tables where shared decisions about the future of our country are made, from resource development to environmental stewardship. We are talking about free, informed, full consent. Second, as part of a renewed relationship between the federal government and First Nations, we will do more to make sure that the voices of your nations are heard in Ottawa. As you know, Harper's changes to the Elections Act actually make it harder for Indigenous peoples to exercise their right to vote. We will repeal those changes. And most importantly, we want to hear directly from you. If I am Prime Minister after the next election, I will go to meet with First Nations leaders each and every year of my government's mandate. And in our party, Liberal members of Parliament will always be strong members, strong voices for their communities. Ottawa needs to hear from you far more than you need to hear from Ottawa. And third, to support the work of reconciliation and continue the necessary process of truth-telling and healing, we will work with you to enact the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, starting with the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The second theme I want to speak about today is the urgent need to expand fairness and equality of opportunity for Aboriginal communities. Without this, all of the commitments I have spoken of for repairing and renewing the relationship will prove fruitless. Restoring the idea of fairness is at the heart of the Liberal plan for this country. Sadly, far too many First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit peoples have been systematically sidelined and denied access to the basic necessities that most Canadians take for granted, the building blocks for fairness and opportunity. As National Chief Bellegarde is right to point out, the current gap between Canadians and Aboriginal peoples is wide and worrisome. A United Nations index that measures living conditions places Canada 8th in the world. But when those same indicators are applied to Aboriginal communities, they come 63rd in that list. That is unacceptable. History has shown that a top-down approach gets us nowhere when it comes to closing that gap. What we need is a collaborative approach similar to the one that resulted in the Kelowna Accord. A process that respects the experiences of Aboriginal peoples and gives you a real say in setting priorities and developing solutions to the challenges communities face every day. That last part bears repeating. If the federal government sets priorities and devises solutions without the meaningful input of Aboriginal communities, those solutions will fail. Here's what a Liberal government will do differently. We will immediately re-engage in the renewed, respectful, and inclusive nation-to-nation process I spoke of earlier. Our shared priority will be to advance progress on the issues you have prioritized, issues like housing, infrastructure, health and mental health care, community safety and policing, child welfare, and education. And we will ensure that the Kelowna Accord and the spirit of reconciliation that drove it is embraced and its objectives implemented in a manner that meets today's challenges, we will make up for 10 long-lost years. As a part of this, we will immediately lift the 2% cap on funding for First Nations programs. That limit, in place for nearly 20 years, has not kept up with the demographic realities of your communities or the actual costs of program delivery. Simply put, none of our shared goals can be achieved under the status quo. We need a new fiscal relationship that provides your communities with sufficient, predictable, and sustained funding. Increasing First Nations' own source revenues, whether through revenue sharing or other mechanisms, is a priority. Together, we will build this new fiscal relationship for the benefit of Aboriginal peoples and all Canadians. When it comes to deciding where investments should be made, we will look to First Nations leadership for guidance. However, there are 3 specific funding priorities that do come to mind. First, education. This is one funding area where we can't afford to wait. We will make significant new investments in First Nations education beyond those promised but not delivered by Mr. Harper last year. We will make those investments immediately to help close the chronic funding gap. L'avenir des enfants des Premières Nations n'est pas seulement votre avenir, mais celui du Canada. Les communautés, éducateurs et élèves des Premières Nations ne devraient pas avoir à attendre un seul jour de plus pour obtenir les ressources essentielles dont ils ont besoin. En même temps, nous veillerons à ce que les Premières Nations aient le contrôle de l'éducation de leur peuple. L'éducation et les réformes de l'éducation sont une priorité de votre Assemblée, tout comme nous. Cependant, contrairement à M. Harper, nous sommes convaincus que les réformes en éducation doivent être menées par les Premières Nations. Donc, nous n'imposerons jamais de solution venue d'en haut. We still need to work to ensure that First Nations have control over First Nations education. Education and education reforms are a priority for your Assembly, and it's a priority that we share. But unlike Mr. Harper, we believe that education reforms must be First Nations-led. We will never impose solutions from the top down. A second priority is ensuring that all First Nations receive equitable funding for child and family services on reserves. 5 minutes. It is unconscionable that your Assembly and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society had to turn to the Canadian Human Rights Commission to ensure equality of service and justice. It is shameful that the important advocacy work of leaders like Cindy Blackstock is met with suspicion and retaliation rather than appreciation and thanks that she deserves. And third, finally, we will also provide substantial new funding to support your ability to promote, preserve, and enhance Indigenous languages and cultures. For me, this is essential. A language is an expression of ways of thinking and cultural understanding. Knowledge of one's language is directly related to better physical, mental, and spiritual health. We know from experience the vital role that language plays in building strong communities, healing, education, development, strong families, and a reconnection to identity. Simply put, a healthy language means healthy individuals and healthy communities. Again, these are just some of the ways in which a more respectful and productive relationship can be established between Ottawa and First Nations, and some of the outcomes we hope to achieve through that collective hard work. I do want to address one additional issue before I wrap up, and that's the importance of a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Victims' families, Aboriginal leaders, all the premiers, non-governmental organizations, the international community, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have all concluded that a national public inquiry is needed. Only Harper and his Conservative government disagree. But what else could we expect from a leader who refuses to admit that the disappearance and death of nearly 1,200 Indigenous women and girls is an ongoing national tragedy that must be brought to an end? A Liberal government, in contrast, will immediately launch an inquiry. The process by which it is established will be fully inclusive, designed to find justice for the victims and healing for their families. L'enquête visera à recommander des mesures concrètes afin que les gouvernements, la police et les autres intervenants puissent résoudre ces crimes et en éviter de nouveaux. Il ne s'agit pas d'ignorer la vérité, même si elle est désagréable, mais de comprendre et de prendre des mesures pour traiter les causes profondes de cette tragédie nationale. Il y a 7 ans, M. Harper a déclaré que le moment était venu de forger une nouvelle relation entre les peuples autochtones et les autres Canadiens, une relation fondée sur la connaissance de notre histoire commune, le respect mutuel et la volonté d'avancer ensemble. Ce sont des mots forts. Toutefois, le juge Sinclair nous a rappelé que les mots n'étaient pas suffisants. Les mots ne seront jamais suffisants tant et aussi longtemps que le gouvernement n'a pas la volonté politique d'être un partenaire véritable et honnête. Même un mot comme « équité », qui revêt d'une telle importance de notre identité canadienne, n'a aucun poids si elle n'est pas suivie de mesures concrètes et quantifiables. In closing, I see you guys standing now, let me say this. The Liberal Party has a plan that will bring about real change, and I have a great team to help us get there. I commit to you that a Liberal government will work with you to build a renewed relationship based on trust, respect, and mutual understanding in the spirit and intent of the original treaties. I want to go back to that day at Rideau Hall during the closing ceremonies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was struck with profound hope that day. From this government, that hope was misplaced, but I have not and will not lose sight of that goal. I believe that the quality of life gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples can be closed. I believe that if we want a Canada we can all be truly proud of, that gap must be closed. I believe that a respectful, cooperative partnership is not only possible, it is a sacred responsibility inherited from past generations and entrusted to us by future ones. I believe that reconciliation is not an Aboriginal issue, it is a Canadian issue. And I believe it is time that we came together to build that better future for all our communities and all our children. And I look forward to sharing that journey in partnership with all of you. Miigwech.
He used up all his time, so we can't have any questions. You're going to have to corner him in the hallway.
I look forward to that.
But we have a presentation as well, Justin, for coming here. And I mentioned early on the importance of sage, cedar, sweetgrass, tobacco. We present this weekusk, we know in Cree, weekusk is sweetgrass. And so we present this to you. And as well, a birch bark canoe. But the interesting thing is, there's no paddle with this one. We're going to give him a paddle in December, you know, if he wins, and then we'll pull in the same direction together. So we present that to you. But thanks for coming.
That's okay. You guys know my dad. I have lots of paddles.
He's got a lot of paddles.